filled with the cigars, champagne, and the rustle of expensive suits. Outside men, diplomats, ambassadors, representatives of empires are drawing lines across a map. But this is no ordinary map, it's Africa, a continent of 500 million acres, home to thousands of kingdoms, languages, and ancient civilizations stretching back millennia. And in this room, over the course of 3 months, these men will divide it all without a single African voice present, no kings, no queens, no representatives, no consent, just pens, rulers, and ambition. This is the story of how Africa was carved up like a cake at a dinner party. This is the story of the Berlin Conference, the meeting that changed the fate of an entire continent. And what happened in that room would echo for more than a century. Welcome to Africa Hidden History. I'm your host. And today we are diving into one of the most consequential events in African history, an event that most Africans never witnessed, yet shaped every border, every conflict, and every political struggle lying on the continent today. The Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885 is often called the Scramble for Africa. But that phrase makes it sound chaotic, accidental, like a race where everyone just happened to show up at the same time. The truth is far more calculated. This was a summit, a negotiation, a deliberate, organized effort by European powers to claim African land, resources, and people as their own. And they did it with rules, treaties, and legal language, all designed to make colonization look civilized. In this documentary, we'll explore what Africa looked like before the conference. Thriving kingdoms, powerful rulers, and complex societies. Why European powers suddenly wanted to divide Africa in the 1880s. What actually happened in that conference room in Berlin. How the artificial borders drawn by Europeans still cause conflict today. And most importantly, the hidden resistance, the forgotten voices, and the legacy that Africa is still recovering from. By the end of this documentary, you'll understand how a single meeting in Europe reshaped an entire continent and why it still matters today. Let's begin. To understand what was stolen, we first need to understand what existed. In the 1870s and early 1880s, Africa was not a blank slate. It was not a dark continent waiting to be discovered. That myth was a European invention, a convenient lie that justified what came next. Africa in the 19th century was a mosaic of empires, kingdoms, chiefdoms, and city-states. Some were ancient, some were new. But all were complex, organized societies with their own systems of governance, trade, law, and culture. In West Africa, the Ashanti Empire controlled a vast territory rich in gold. Their capital, Kumasi, was a thriving city with royal courts, markets, and sophisticated political structures. The Ashanti traded with Europeans, yes, but on their own terms. They were not subjects. They were rivals. In southern Africa, the Zulu kingdom, under the leadership of King Cetshwayo, commanded one of the most disciplined and effective military forces on the continent. The Zulu had defeated British forces in battle multiple times. They were a power to be reckoned with. In East Africa, the kingdom of Buganda, located in present-day Uganda, controlled trade routes around Lake Victoria. The Kabaka, the king, ruled over the centralized government with provinces, governors, and a sophisticated court system. In the Horn of Africa, the Ethiopian Empire remained one of the few African states with international diplomatic recognition. Under Emperor Johannes IV and later Menelik II, Ethiopia maintained its sovereignty and even expanded its territory. And then there were the Islamic empires of the Sahel, the Sokoto Caliphate in present-day Nigeria, the Tukuler Empire in present-day Senegal and Mali, and the Sultanate of Zanzibar, on the East African coast. These were not isolated villages. These were states with armies, universities, and long-distance trade networks stretching across the Sahara, the Indian Ocean, and into the Middle East. But Europe didn't see empires. Europe saw opportunity. By the 1880s, Europe was in the throes of the Industrial Revolution. Factories in Britain, Germany, France, and Belgium were producing goods at an unprecedented scale. But production requires raw materials, rubber, timber, ivory, cotton, minerals, palm oil. And Africa had all of it. But there was a problem. For most of the 19th century, European contact with Africa was limited to coastal trading posts. European merchants would trade guns, cloth, and alcohol for African goods, gold, ivory, enslaved people. But Europeans didn't control the interior. African kingdoms did. That began to change in the 1870s. Technological advances, steamships, the Maxim gun, quinine to treat malaria made it possible for Europeans to venture deeper into Africa. Explorers like David Livingstone, Henry Morton Stanley, and Pierre Savognon de Brazza traveled up African rivers, mapped territories, and reported back to European capitals about the wealth waiting to be claimed. At the same time, European nations were in fierce competition. Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, Portugal, Spain, and Italy all wanted to expand their empires. If one country claimed a piece of Africa, another would try to block it or claim their own piece. Tensions were rising, and that's when Otto von Bismarck, the Chancellor of Germany, stepped in. Germany under Bismarck was a latecomer to the colonial game. Britain and France already had colonies. Portugal had been in Africa for centuries. But Germany had almost nothing. And Bismarck was worried, not about Africa necessarily, but about European stability. He feared that competition over Africa would lead to war between European powers. So he proposed a solution, a conference. If the European powers could sit down and agree on rules for dividing Africa peacefully, diplomatically, then everyone could expand their empires without conflict. At least that was the pitch. In reality, Bismarck wanted to secure German interests in Africa while appearing as a neutral mediator, and it worked. In November 1884, representatives from 14 European nations gathered in Berlin. Germany, Britain, France, Portugal, Spain, Belgium, Italy, Austria, Hungary, Denmark, the Netherlands, Sweden, Norway, the Ottoman Empire, Russia, and the United States. Notice who wasn't invited. Africa. Not a single African king, queen, diplomat, or representative was present. Not the Ashanti, not the Zulu, not the Ethiopians, no one. Europe was about to decide the fate of a continent without the people who lived there. Let's meet the players in this high-stakes game, Germany and Otto von Bismarck, the host and the architect. Bismarck was a master diplomat. He didn't care much about colonies. He saw them as expensive distractions, but he understood power. By hosting the conference, he positioned Germany as a key player in European politics and secured German claims in East and Southwest Africa. King Leopold II of Belgium, perhaps the most sinister figure at the conference. Leopold didn't represent Belgium officially. He represented himself as the head of the International African Association. His target, the Congo Basin. Leopold claimed he wanted to bring civilization and Christianity to Africa. In reality, he wanted rubber and ivory, and he was willing to commit atrocities to get them. We'll return to his story later. Britain, the dominant global empire, represented by Sir Edward Mallet. Britain already controlled Egypt, parts of West Africa and Southern Africa. Their goal at the conference was simple: protect what they had and grab what they could. Britain wanted the Nile River, the Cape, and anything in between. France, represented by Baron de Courcelles, France had already established control over Algeria and parts of West Africa. Their ambition was to create a continuous empire from the Atlantic to the Red Sea, a horizontal band across Africa. Portugal, the oldest European presence in Africa dating back to the 1400s. Portugal controlled Angola and Mozambique, but other powers, especially Britain and Germany, were trying to limit Portuguese expansion. Italy, Spain, and the smaller powers. Hungry for prestige and territory, but lacking the resources of Britain or France, they would grab whatever was left over. And then there were the Africans, the people whose land was being divided, whose futures were being written by strangers. At the time of the Berlin Conference, Africa was home to powerful rulers who had no idea what was happening in that conference room. King Prempeh, the first of the Ashanti, a young king who inherited a powerful empire. He would later resist British colonization, but by then the borders had already been drawn. King Cetshwayo of the Zulu, a brilliant military strategist who had defeated the British at the Battle of Isandlwana in 1879. But after his defeat later that year, his kingdom was fractured. The British would use the Berlin Conference to justify further encroachment. Emperor Menelik II of Ethiopia, one of the few African leaders who understood what was happening. Menelik would later defeat Italy at the Battle of Adwa in 1896, preserving Ethiopia's independence, but he was not invited to Berlin. Samori Ture, a Muslim military leader in West Africa who built a powerful empire in present-day Guinea, Mali, and Côte d'Ivoire. He resisted French colonization for nearly 2 decades, but the Berlin Conference gave France the legal justification to invade his territory. These were not primitive societies. These were nations with armies, economies, and diplomatic traditions. But in Berlin, they were treated as if they didn't exist. On November 15th, 1884, the Berlin Conference officially opened. The location was the Reich Chancellery in Berlin, a grand building designed to project German power and prestige. The atmosphere was cordial, champagne flowed, handshakes were exchanged, but beneath the pleasantries, this was a negotiation among rivals. Each nation wanted to maximize its gains while minimizing conflict with the others. Otto von Bismarck opened the conference with a speech about civilization, free trade, and the improvement of Africa. The language was polite, even noble, but the goal was clear: divide Africa. Over the next 3 months, the delegates would meet regularly, drafting agreements, negotiating boundaries, and establishing the rules of colonization. The Berlin Conference produced several key agreements that would define the colonization of Africa. Let's break them down. 1. The principle of effective occupation. This was the most important rule. It stated that for a European power to claim African territory, it had to demonstrate effective occupation, meaning it had to establish a physical presence. Simply drawing a line on a map wasn't enough. You needed soldiers, administrators, or settlers on the ground. This rule was designed to prevent empty claims, but in practice, it triggered a race. European powers scrambled to send expeditions into the African interior to plant flags and establish forts before their rivals could. 2. Freedom of navigation on African rivers. The conference declared that the Congo River and the Niger River were to be free and open for trade by all nations. This sounds reasonable, but it had a dark purpose. It allowed European merchants and militaries to travel deep into Africa's interior, bypassing African control over trade routes. For African kingdoms that had grown wealthy by controlling river trade, this was devastating. The rules of the game had changed without their input. 3. Recognition of the Congo Free State. This was King Leopold II's great victory. The conference officially recognized the Congo Free State, not as a colony of Belgium, but as Leopold's personal property. Leopold had spent years lobbying European governments, presenting himself as a humanitarian who wanted to abolish the slave trade and bring Christianity to Africa. He hired the famous explorer Henry Morton Stanley to establish outposts in the Congo Basin and make treaties with local chiefs, treaties that the chiefs often didn't understand or were coerced into signing. In Berlin, Leopold's efforts paid off. The European powers agreed to recognize his control over the Congo. It was a decision that would lead to one of the greatest atrocities in human history. We'll return to that later. 4. The partition of East Africa Germany secured control over present-day Tanzania, Rwanda, and Burundi, areas that would become German East Africa. Britain secured Kenya and Uganda, as well as influence over Zanzibar. Italy was granted parts of Somalia and the coastline of Eritrea, though they would later suffer a humiliating defeat when they tried to conquer Ethiopia. 5. The division of West Africa France claimed a massive swath of West Africa, present-day Senegal, Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, Guinea, and much of the Sahel. Britain took the Gold Coast, Ghana, Nigeria, and Sierra Leone. Germany claimed Togo and Cameroon. Portugal held on to small territories in Guinea-Bissau and parts of Angola. 6. Southern Africa, Britain already controlled the Cape Colony in South Africa, but they wanted more. Cecil Rhodes, a British businessman and imperialist, dreamed of a British empire from Cape to Cairo. The Berlin Conference helped legitimize British expansion into present-day Zimbabwe, Rhodesia named after Rhodes, Zambia, and Botswana. Portugal maintained control over Angola and Mozambique, though Britain and Germany tried to limit Portuguese expansion. On February 26, 1885, after 3 months of negotiations, the delegates signed the General Act of the Berlin Conference. It was a document of 38 articles that codified the agreements made during the conference. The General Act established the rules of colonization. It recognized European claims across Africa. It divided the continent into spheres of influence. And it did all of this without a single African signature. The conference was over. The carving of Africa had begun. The Berlin Conference didn't create colonies overnight. What it did was provide a legal framework, a set of rules that European powers agreed to follow. Now the real work began: conquest. Over the next 20 years, European nations launched military expeditions into Africa to enforce the borders drawn in Berlin. African kingdoms resisted fiercely. The Ashanti fought the British in multiple wars. The Zulu resisted. Samori Ture held off the French for nearly 2 decades. The Herero and Nama people in German Southwest Africa, Namibia, waged guerrilla warfare against German forces. The Maji Maji rebellion in German East Africa saw tens of thousands of Africans rise up against colonial rule. But the technological gap was overwhelming. European armies had machine guns, artillery, and steamships. African armies, no matter how brave or disciplined, were at a disadvantage. One by one, African kingdoms fell. By 1914, nearly 90% of Africa was under European control. Only Ethiopia and Liberia remained independent. One of the biggest lies of the Berlin Conference was that colonization was about helping Africa. European leaders spoke endlessly about the civilizing mission, the idea that they were bringing progress, education, Christianity, and modern infrastructure to backward societies. But this was propaganda. The truth is that colonization was about extraction. Europe wanted Africa's resources: rubber, ivory, gold, diamonds, copper, palm oil, and they were willing to use violence to get them. The civilizing mission was a cover story. Yes, some missionaries built schools and hospitals, But those institutions served the colonial system. Schools taught Africans to speak European languages and to see European culture as superior. Hospitals treated workers so they could continue laboring in mines and plantations. Infrastructure, railways, roads, ports wasn't built for Africans. It was built to move resources from the interior to the coast where they could be shipped to Europe. We need to talk about King Leopold II and the Congo. When the Berlin Conference recognized Leopold's control over the Congo, the European powers believed his promises. He said he wanted to abolish the slave trade, bring Christianity, and promote free trade. It was all a lie. What Leopold created in the Congo was a nightmare. The Congo Free State became his personal rubber plantation. Leopold never set foot in the Congo, but he ruled it from Brussels through a network of brutal enforcers. Africans were forced to collect rubber from wild vines in the jungle. If they didn't meet their quotas, they were punished, whipped, mutilated, or killed. Villages that resisted were burned. Hostages were taken to force compliance. One of the most horrifying practices was the cutting off of hands. Belgian officers would cut off the hands of Africans, men, women, children, as proof that they had used bullets to punish resistors rather than wasting ammunition on hunting. Estimates vary, but historians believe that between 1885 and 1908, approximately 10 million Congolese people died due to violence, starvation, disease, and forced labor under Leopold's rule. It was one of the deadliest genocides in history, and it all started with a handshake at the Berlin Conference. Eventually, international outrage forced Belgium to take control of the Congo away from Leopold in 1908. But the damage was done. The Congo would never fully recover. One of the most destructive legacies of the Berlin Conference is the borders. When European diplomats drew lines on maps in Berlin, they didn't care about African realities. They didn't care about ethnic groups, languages, or kingdoms. They cared about rivers, resources, and strategic locations. As a result, colonial borders cut straight through communities. The Somali people were divided between British Somaliland, Italian Somaliland, French Somaliland, and Ethiopia. The Maasai people were split between British Kenya and German East Africa, later Tanzania. The Yoruba and the Hausa peoples were divided between British Nigeria and French colonies. Families were separated, trade networks were disrupted, kingdoms were split in half. And in some cases, European powers deliberately grouped rival ethnic groups into the same colony, creating divisions that could be exploited to maintain control. This strategy is called divide and rule, and it worked. By pitting African groups against each other, colonial powers could prevent unified resistance. These artificial borders still exist today, and they are the root cause of many modern conflicts, from the Rwandan genocide to the ongoing instability in the Democratic Republic of Congo, South Sudan, and Somalia. Here's something you won't hear in most history books. Africans fought back. The narrative that Africa was passively colonized is a lie. Across the continent, Africans resisted militarily, politically, and culturally. Ethiopia. In 1896, Emperor Menelik II led Ethiopian forces to a stunning victory over Italy at the Battle of Adwa. It was the only time an African nation decisively defeated a European colonial army. Ethiopia remained independent, and Adwa became a symbol of African resistance worldwide. The Zulu Kingdom. Even after defeat, Zulu resistance continued for years. The British had to use overwhelming force and divide and conquer tactics to suppress Zulu power. Samori Ture. In West Africa, Samori Ture waged a brilliant guerrilla campaign against the French for nearly 20 years. He used hit-and-run tactics, retreated when necessary, and built a new empire every time the French destroyed the old one. He was finally captured in 1898, but he remains a hero in West African history. The Maji Maji Rebellion in 1905 to 1907. In German East Africa, diverse ethnic groups united against German rule. They believed that a sacred water, Meiji, would protect them from bullets. It didn't, but the rebellion showed the power of African unity and resistance. These stories are often ignored, but they matter. They show that Africans were not passive victims. They were fighters, strategists, and leaders who refused to accept colonization without a fight. By 1914, the map of Africa had been completely redrawn. The continent was divided into colonies, protectorates, and spheres of influence, and the impact was immediate and devastating. African economies were restructured to serve European interests. Instead of producing goods for local consumption or regional trade, Africans were forced to grow cash crops, cotton, cocoa, coffee, peanuts, for export to Europe. Traditional systems of governance were destroyed or co-opted. African kings and chiefs who cooperated with colonial authorities were allowed to remain in power, but only as puppets. Those who resisted were deposed or killed. African cultures were suppressed. European languages, English, French, Portuguese, German, were imposed. African religions were deemed pagan and replaced with Christianity. African names, clothing, and customs were discouraged or banned, and African labor was exploited on a massive scale. Millions of Africans were forced to work in mines, plantations, and infrastructure projects under brutal conditions. Many died from exhaustion, disease, or violence. The wealth extracted from Africa fueled European industrialization. The rubber from the Congo powered the automobile industry. The gold and diamonds from South Africa enriched British and German banks. The cocoa from West Africa fueled European chocolate factories. Africa was being drained economically, culturally, and spiritually. The colonization of Africa didn't happen in isolation. Africa became entangled in global conflicts, especially the two world wars. During World War I and World War II, millions of African soldiers fought for European powers. Africans fought in Europe, in North Africa, in Asia. They were promised freedom, equality, and recognition for their service. But when the wars ended, those promises were broken. Africans returned home to the same colonial oppression they had left behind, but something had changed. African soldiers had seen the world. They had fought alongside Europeans and seen that Europeans were not invincible. They had been exposed to ideas, democracy, self-determination, independence, and they began to organize. In the 1940s and 1950s, independence movements spread across Africa. Leaders like Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, Jomo Kenyatta in Kenya, Patrice Lumumba in the Congo, and Julius Nyerere in Tanzania began demanding freedom. In 1957, Ghana became the first sub-Saharan African nation to gain independence. Others followed. By the 1960s, dozens of African nations had achieved independence, but independence came with a catch. African nations gained their flags, their anthems, and their seats at the United Nations. But the structures of colonialism remained. The borders drawn in Berlin stayed in place. The artificial divisions, the rival ethnic groups forced into the same nation, none of that changed. European and American corporations continued to control Africa's resources. The mines, the oil fields, the plantations, many remained in foreign hands or were managed by African elites loyal to Western interests. And when African leaders tried to assert true independence, when they tried to nationalize resources, redistribute land, or align with the Soviet Union, they were overthrown. The CIA, British intelligence, and French military forces intervened to install leaders who would cooperate. Patrice Lumumba, the first prime minister of the independent Congo, was assassinated in 1961 with the support of Belgium and the United States. Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary leader of Burkina Faso, was killed in 1987. These are just two examples among many. This system is called neo-colonialism. Colonialism without the colonies, and it continues today. The legacy of the Berlin Conference is still visible today. The Rwandan genocide of 1994, in which nearly 800,000 people were killed, has roots in colonial divisions. The Belgian colonizers favored the Tutsi minority over the Hutu majority, creating resentment that exploded into violence decades later. The ongoing conflict in the Democratic Republic of Congo, one of the deadliest conflicts since World War II, is fueled by a competition over resources and instability created by artificial borders. The civil wars in Sudan and South Sudan, the instability in Somalia, the ethnic tensions in Nigeria, all of these conflicts have roots in the decisions made in Berlin in 1884. The borders drawn by Europeans were never meant to create stable nations. They were meant to facilitate extraction, and they succeeded. But here's the important part. Africa is not defined by colonization. Despite everything, the exploitation, the violence, the artificial borders, Africa has survived. And in many ways, Africa is thriving. African economies are among the fastest growing in the world. African artists, musicians, and filmmakers are shaping global culture. African scientists, engineers, and entrepreneurs are driving innovation. And Africans are reclaiming their history. They are telling the stories that were silenced. They are challenging the borders that were imposed. They are demanding justice for the atrocities committed. The Berlin Conference tried to erase Africa's agency, but it failed. Africa is still here, and Africa is rising. So, what's the lesson here? What do we take away from the story of the Berlin Conference? First, understand that history is written by the powerful. For decades, the story of Africa was told by Europeans. They called it discovery, civilization, and progress. But those were lies. The truth is that Africa was invaded, exploited, and divided. Second, recognize that borders are not natural. The lines on the map of Africa are not ancient. They are barely 140 years old. They were drawn by people who had never set foot on African soil, who didn't speak African languages, and who didn't care about African lives. Third, remember that resistance is always part of the story. Africans did not passively accept colonization. They fought. They resisted. They preserved their cultures, languages, and identities despite overwhelming odds. And finally, understand that the past is not dead. The decisions made in Berlin in 1884 still shape Africa today. The borders are still there. The economic exploitation continues in new forms. The legacy of colonialism is alive, but so is the legacy of resistance. The story of Africa is not a story of victimhood. It's a story of survival, resilience, and determination. It's a story of people who refuse to be erased. And that story is far from over. Thank you for watching this episode of Africa Hidden History. If you made it this far, you now know the truth about the Berlin Conference, the meeting that carved up Africa without African consent. You know about the resistance, the atrocities, and the legacy that still shapes the continent today. If you found this documentary valuable, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs to hear this story. This is the history they don't teach in schools, but it's the history that matters. Next time, we'll explore another hidden chapter of African history. Some options include the kingdom of Kush and its rivalry with Egypt, the Great Zimbabwe Civilization, the Haitian Revolution and its African roots, or the story of Queen Nazinga of Ndongo and Matamba, a warrior queen who fought Portuguese colonization for 40 years. Let me know in the comments which story you want to hear next. Until then, remember, Africa's history is not just about what was done to it. It's about what Africa has always been: powerful, resilient, and unstoppable. See you in the next documentary.
Let's delve into the key parameters and main application scenarios of the QED 400G.
In a single room, over the course of just 3 months, the fate of an entire continent was decided. The year was 1884. The place, Berlin, Germany. Around a table sat men in tailored suits, smoking cigars, sipping wine, and drawing lines across maps with rulers and pencils.
None of them had ever set foot in the heart of Africa. None of them spoke the languages of the people whose lands they were dividing. And yet, with a stroke of a pen, they carved up kingdoms that had stood for centuries. They split families, erased borders, and declared ownership over lands they had never seen. By the time the conference ended, almost the entire African continent had been handed over to European powers. No African leader was invited, no African voice was heard. This is the story of the Scramble for Africa, a race so ruthless, so rapid, and so devastating that it changed the course of history forever. Within just 3 decades, over 90% of Africa fell under European control. But how did it happen? Why did it happen? And what were the Africans doing while their land was being stolen from under them? Stay with us, because this is not just a story of conquest. It's a story of resistance, survival, and a legacy that still shapes Africa today. Welcome to Africa Hidden History. I'm your host, and today we are diving deep into one of the most transformative and tragic periods in African history, the Scramble for Africa. Between 1881 and 1914, European powers, Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, Italy, Portugal, and Spain, raced to claim African territories. They called it exploration and civilization. But in reality, it was colonization, exploitation, domination. In this documentary, we will walk through the entire timeline of the Scramble. We'll explore the economic greed, the political rivalries, and the technological advantages that made this conquest possible. We'll introduce you to the African kingdoms and leaders who resisted, some successfully, others tragically, and we'll uncover the hidden truths, the secret deals, the manufactured borders, and the long-lasting scars left on the African continent. This story begins in the late 1800s, but its roots stretch back centuries. To understand the Scramble, we must first understand what Africa looked like before the Europeans arrived in full force. We must understand the wealth, the power, and the complexity of African societies that many history books choose to ignore. So let's go back to a time when Africa was not a dark continent, but a land of thriving civilizations, ancient trade routes, and independent kingdoms. Let's begin. Before European powers descended upon Africa with their guns and treaties, the continent was home to hundreds of distinct ethnic groups, languages, and political systems. From the Sahara to the Cape, Africa was far from the uncivilized wilderness that European propaganda later portrayed. In West Africa, the Ashanti Empire controlled rich gold mines and commanded a powerful military. The Sokoto Caliphate stretched across what is now northern Nigeria, governing millions under Islamic law. In East Africa, the Sultanate of Zanzibar dominated the Indian Ocean trade, dealing in ivory, spices, and textiles. In Southern Africa, the Zulu Kingdom had transformed into a formidable military state under the leadership of King Shaka. They were not primitive tribes waiting to be discovered. These were organized states with courts, armies, economies, and diplomatic relations with one another. They traded with the Middle East, India,
and even China long before Europeans claimed to have opened Africa to the world. But by the mid-1800s, Europe was changing. And with that change came a hunger, an insatiable hunger for resources, markets, and power. The Industrial Revolution, which began in Britain in the late 1700s, transformed Europe. Factories needed raw materials, cotton, rubber, palm oil, metals, and minerals. European industries needed new markets to sell their manufactured goods, and European nations needed prestige, territories that would prove their dominance on the world stage. At the same time, new technologies gave Europeans unprecedented advantages. Steamships could navigate Africa's rivers. The telegraph allowed instant communication across continents. Railways could transport troops and goods deep into the interior. And perhaps most importantly, the Maxim machine gun, the first fully automatic weapon, gave European soldiers the ability to mow down African warriors armed with spears and outdated muskets. One British officer infamously summarized the imbalance. Whatever happens, we have got the Maxim gun and they have not. But technology alone doesn't explain the scramble. There was also a shift in European attitudes. By the 1880s, a dangerous idea had taken hold in Europe: the belief in racial superiority. Pseudoscientific theories claimed that Europeans were biologically and culturally superior to Africans. This ideology was used to justify conquest, enslavement, and exploitation. It was called the white man's burden, the notion that Europeans had a moral duty to civilize Africa. Christian missionaries arrived in Africa, genuinely believing they were saving souls. But behind them came soldiers, merchants, and administrators who saw Africa as a treasure chest waiting to be unlocked. Even before the official scramble began, European powers had established coastal footholds. The Portuguese controlled Angola and Mozambique. The British held the Cape Colony in South Africa and trading posts in West Africa. The French had expanded their influence in Algeria and Senegal, but these were still small, scattered territories. Everything was about to change. The man who lit the fuse of the scramble was not a soldier or a statesman. He was a king with a private ambition, King Leopold II of Belgium. Leopold was obsessed with acquiring a colony. Belgium was a small country, and Leopold envied the vast empires of Britain and France. So he turned his eyes to Central Africa, specifically the Congo Basin, a massive region rich in ivory, rubber, and timber. But Leopold was cunning. He didn't invade the Congo as a national conquest. Instead, he hired the explorer Henry Morton Stanley to travel through the Congo, signing treaties with local chiefs. These treaties, written in languages the chiefs couldn't read, supposedly granted Leopold personal control over their lands. In 1885, the Congo Free State was born, not as a Belgian colony, but as Leopold's private property. He ruled it like a corporate plantation, extracting wealth through forced labor, mutilation, and mass murder. Millions of Congolese people died under his brutal regime, but Leopold's actions did something else. They set off alarm bells across Europe. If Belgium, a tiny nation, could claim the heart of Africa, what was stopping Britain, France, and Germany from doing the same? The race was on. Let's meet the players in this imperial game. Britain was the dominant global power, controlling the seas and vast territories in Asia and the Americas. In Africa, Britain wanted to secure a continuous chain of territories from Cairo in the north to Cape Town in the south, a vision championed by the imperialist Cecil Rhodes. France sought to build a horizontal empire across Africa, stretching from Senegal in the west to Djibouti in the east. French leaders saw African colonies as essential to maintaining France's status as a great power. Germany, newly unified under Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, arrived late to the imperial stage. But Bismarck saw colonies as useful bargaining chips in European diplomacy. Germany claimed Togoland, Cameroon, Namibia, and Tanganyika. Portugal, once the dominant European power in Africa, clung desperately to Angola and Mozambique, hoping to connect them with a transcontinental corridor. Italy, also newly unified, sought colonies to rival the other European powers. Italy invaded Ethiopia and Somalia with disastrous results. Belgium, under King Leopold II, controlled the Congo through ruthless exploitation. Spain held small territories in Western Sahara and Equatorial Guinea. These nations saw Africa as a chessboard. African lives were merely pawns. But Africa was not a passive victim. Across the continent, leaders and kingdoms fought back with intelligence, diplomacy, and military might. Menelik II of Ethiopia was perhaps the most successful. He modernized his army, imported European weapons, and skillfully played European powers against one another. In 1896, his forces defeated Italy at the Battle of Adwa, preserving Ethiopia's independence. Samori Ture, the founder of the Wasulu Empire in West Africa, waged a brilliant guerrilla war against the French for nearly 20 years. He adapted his tactics, built his own weapons factories, and moved his entire kingdom to avoid capture. Ya Asantewa, the queen mother of the Ashanti Empire, led a rebellion against British rule in 1900. Though ultimately defeated, her courage became a symbol of resistance. The Zulu kingdom, under leaders like Cetshwayo, fought fiercely against British invasion. At the Battle of Isandlwana in 1879, Zulu warriors inflicted one of the worst defeats ever suffered by a modern European army. The Mahdi, Muhammad Ahmad, led a religious uprising in Sudan, defeating Egyptian and British forces and establishing an independent Islamic state that lasted over a decade. These were not helpless victims. These were strategic, determined leaders who understood the threat they faced and fought with everything they had. But they faced overwhelming odds. For most of the 19th century, European control in Africa was limited to coastal regions. The interior, what Europeans called Darkest Africa, remained largely unknown to them. Disease, difficult terrain, and strong African kingdoms kept Europeans at bay. But European explorers began mapping Africa's rivers and lakes. David Livingstone, Henry Morton Stanley, and others trekked through the continent, sending back reports of vast resources and uncivilized peoples in need of salvation. These explorers were celebrated as heroes in Europe, but they were also scouts, preparing the way for conquest. By the 1870s, European traders and missionaries had established small outposts. Tensions began to rise as European powers competed for influence. Then came the trigger: Leopold's Congo scheme, and with it the Berlin Conference. In November 1884, representatives from 14 European nations gathered in Berlin. The conference was organized by German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck and was officially called the Congo Conference. The stated purpose: to regulate European colonization and trade in Africa, prevent conflicts between European powers, and promote civilization on the continent. The real purpose: to divide Africa among themselves without going to war. No African representatives were invited, not a single one. Over 3 months, European diplomats negotiated, argued, and bargained. They drew borders on maps using rivers, mountains, and arbitrary lines of longitude and latitude. They ignored ethnic groups, kingdoms, and historical territories. The conference established several key principles. One, effective occupation. A European power could only claim a territory if it could prove effective control through administration and military presence. Two, free trade zones. Certain regions like the Congo Basin were declared free trade zones open to all European merchants. Three, notification. Any nation claiming new African territory had to notify the others to avoid conflict. The result? Africa was carved up like a birthday cake. Britain took the largest share, France took the second largest, Germany, Belgium, Portugal, Italy, and Spain divided the rest. By the time the conference ended in February 1885, the stage was set for the most rapid and brutal phase of colonization in human history. With the rules established, European powers moved swiftly. Britain expanded aggressively in southern, eastern, and western Africa. Cecil Rhodes, backed by the British South Africa Company, pushed into what would become Rhodesia, modern-day Zimbabwe and Zambia. British forces invaded Egypt in 1882 and gradually extended control up the Nile into Sudan. France launched military campaigns across West and Central Africa. French forces defeated the Tukulor Empire, conquered the kingdoms of Dahomey and Borg, and pushed into the Sahara and Sahel regions. Germany claimed Togoland, Cameroon, German East Africa, Tanganyika, and German Southwest Africa, Namibia. German colonial rule was marked by extreme violence, including the genocide of the Herero and Nama peoples in Namibia. Portugal solidified its hold on Angola and Mozambique, brutally suppressing local resistance. Italy attempted to invade Ethiopia in 1895 but was humiliated at the Battle of Adwa in 1896, a stunning victory for Emperor Menelik II that preserved Ethiopian independence. Belgium, or rather King Leopold, personally tightened his grip on the Congo. Forced labor camps, mutilations, and mass killings turned the Congo into a death zone. Millions died. But Africans did not surrender quietly. Samori Ture fought a mobile guerrilla war against the French. He retreated, regrouped, and struck back. For 16 years, he resisted French expansion, moving his entire empire eastward and even establishing diplomatic relations with the British. He was finally captured in 1898. The Ashanti Empire in modern-day Ghana resisted British invasion multiple times. The British finally defeated the Ashanti in 1900, but only after fierce battles and the courageous leadership of Queen Mother Yaa Asantewa. The Zulu kingdom fought the British in a series of wars. At Isandowana in 1879, Zulu warriors killed over 1,300 British soldiers in one of the most shocking defeats in British military history. But superior British firepower eventually overwhelmed the Zulu. The Mahdi's forces in Sudan defeated an Egyptian-British army led by General Charles Gordon in 1885. The Mahdi state survived until 1898, when British forces armed with machine guns massacred thousands at the Battle of Omdurman. In German East Africa, the Maji Maji Rebellion, 1905 to 1907, saw diverse ethnic groups unite against German rule. The Germans responded with a scorched earth policy, burning villages and poisoning water sources. Over 300,000 Africans died. Each resistance movement was met with overwhelming violence. European powers used starvation, disease, and massacres to crush opposition. By 1900, the map of Africa had been almost entirely redrawn. Only two nations remained independent: Ethiopia and Liberia. European colonial administrations began to establish control. They built railways to extract resources. They imposed taxes to force Africans into wage labor. They divided ethnic groups and imposed foreign languages, laws, and customs. Borders drawn in Berlin cut through kingdoms, splitting families and communities. The Yoruba people found themselves divided between British Nigeria and French Dahomey. The Somali people were split among British Somaliland, Italian Somaliland, French Somaliland, and Ethiopia. The Congo people found themselves on opposite sides of the Congo River under Belgian and French rule. These artificial borders ignored centuries of history, culture, and identity. They would become sources of conflict for generations to come. Meanwhile, European powers competed for dominance. Britain and France nearly went to war over a remote outpost in Sudan in 1898 during the Fashoda incident. Tensions between European empires grew, but the scramble itself was over. By 1914, the eve of World War I, Africa had been conquered. One of the great lies of the scramble was the idea that Africa was an empty land waiting to be filled. European maps often labeled vast regions as unexplored or uninhabited, but these lands were not empty. They were home to millions of people with complex societies, trade networks, and governance systems. The myth of emptiness was used to justify theft. Not all Africans resisted European conquest. Some African leaders, traders, and soldiers collaborated with the European powers either out of self-interest, coercion, or the belief that cooperation would protect their people. European colonial armies relied heavily on African soldiers. The French used Senegalese tirailleurs. The British recruited from Kenya, Uganda, and West Africa. Africans fought Africans in wars orchestrated by Europeans. This collaboration was often born of desperation. Some leaders believed that allying with Europeans would protect them from rival African kingdoms. Others were tricked or bribed, but their cooperation helped European powers conquer the continent. The violence of the scramble was often hidden from European publics. Newspapers celebrated colonial expansion as a civilizing mission, but the reality was brutal. In the Congo, King Leopold's agents forced villagers to harvest rubber under threat of mutilation or death. Hands were cut off as punishment for failing to meet quotas. Conservative estimates suggest that 10 million Congolese people died under Leopold's rule. In Namibia, German forces exterminated the Herero and Nama peoples in what is now recognized as the first genocide of the 20th century. Survivors were driven into the desert to die of thirst. In Algeria, French colonial forces used mass killings, forced displacement, and land confiscation to crush resistance. These atrocities were not anomalies, they were the norm. The scramble was fundamentally about profit. European companies extracted raw materials, gold, diamonds, rubber, ivory, palm oil, while forcing Africans into unpaid or underpaid labor. Railways were built not to benefit Africans, but to transport goods from the interior to ports for export to Europe. Taxes were imposed to force Africans to work in mines and plantations. Traditional economies were destroyed. The wealth extracted from Africa fueled European development, but Africa itself was impoverished. European colonizers didn't just steal land and resources, they attempted to erase African culture. Indigenous languages were banned in schools. African religions were suppressed in favor of Christianity. Traditional governance systems were replaced by foreign administrators. African history was rewritten, portraying pre-colonial Africa as backward and primitive. Generations of Africans grew up believing their own cultures were inferior. The psychological damage of colonialism was as deep as the economic exploitation. The borders drawn during the scramble have caused decades of conflict. Ethnic groups that once lived together were split apart. Rival groups that had historically fought were forced into the same colony. When African nations gained independence in the mid-20th century, they inherited these colonial borders. Leaders faced the choice: redraw the borders or keep them. Most chose to keep them, fearing that changing borders would. The scramble laid the foundation for Africa's economic struggles. Colonial economies were designed to extract resources for Europe, not to develop Africa itself. Railways ran from mines to ports, not between African cities. Education systems trained Africans to be clerks and laborers, not engineers and entrepreneurs. Industries were banned to prevent competition with European manufacturers. When African nations gained independence, they inherited economies dependent on exporting raw materials. This dependency continues today. Colonial powers often used the strategy of divide and rule. They favored certain ethnic groups over others, creating hierarchies and resentments. In Rwanda, Belgian colonizers classified people as Hutu or Tutsi based on pseudoscientific criteria. This division contributed to the 1994 genocide. In Nigeria, British colonizers governed the North and South differently, fostering regional tensions that persist. Across Africa, ethnic conflicts rooted in colonial manipulation continue to destabilize nations. Perhaps the deepest legacy of the scramble is psychological. Generations of Africans were taught that their cultures, languages, and histories were inferior. Colonial education systems glorified European civilization while erasing African achievements. Even today, many African countries use European languages as official languages. Western standards of beauty, success, and progress are often seen as superior. Overcoming this internalized oppression remains one of Africa's greatest challenges. But the
Bucks laat je wel heel makkelijk vermogen opbouwen. Bijvoorbeeld door elke maand een vast bedrag in te leggen. Met het Bucks beleggingsplan voor €0 is beleggen voor elke portemonnee mogelijk. Dus ook die voor jou. Vermogen opbouwen met Bucks, een makkelijke gewoonte.
But the scramble also planted the seeds of resistance. African intellectuals, inspired by anti-colonial movements around the world, began organizing for independence. Pan-Africanism, a movement promoting unity among African peoples, emerged in response to colonialism. Leaders like Kwame Nkrumah, Jomo Kenyatta, and Julius Nyerere drew inspiration from the resistance of figures like Samori Ture, Menelik II, and Ya Asantewa. The scramble may have conquered Africa, but it could not break the African spirit. The scramble for Africa was not inevitable. It was a choice made by European leaders driven by greed, ambition, and racism. In just over 3 decades, an entire continent was stolen. Kingdoms that had existed for centuries were destroyed. Millions of lives were lost. Cultures were erased. And the effects of that theft are still felt today. But the scramble also teaches us about resilience. African leaders and peoples fought back with everything they had. Some won battles, some won temporary victories, and Ethiopia won something even greater, lasting independence. The story of the scramble is a reminder that history is not made by destiny. It is made by people, by their decisions, their actions, and their choices. Africa before colonialism was not primitive. It was complex, sophisticated, and dynamic. The narrative that Europeans civilized Africa is a lie designed to justify theft and violence. Today, as African nations continue to reckon with the legacy of colonialism, the lessons of the scramble remain urgent. The fight for true independence, economic, political, and cultural, is ongoing. The scramble may have ended in 1914, but its consequences are still unfolding. Thank you for joining us on this journey through one of the most devastating periods in African history. The scramble for Africa was not just a historical event, it was a turning point that reshaped the world. Understanding it is essential to understanding modern Africa and the modern world. If this documentary opened your eyes, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We dive deep into the hidden histories of Africa, the stories that textbooks leave out. In our next episode, we'll explore the Haitian Revolution and its impact on African liberation movements. You won't want to miss it. Drop a comment below. What shocked you most about the scramble for Africa? What part of this story do you want to learn more about? Remember, history is not just about the past. It's about understanding the present and shaping the future. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and never forget, Africa's story is far from over. This is Africa Hidden History. Peace.